Scientists spent years digging through medieval graveyards across northern France, England, Scandinavia, and Ireland. They pulled bone fragments from Viking burial mounds, lifted skeletons from Norman cemeteries, and unearthed the dead from a rural English churchyard called Priory Orchard in Surrey. They sequenced ancient genomes, mapped Y chromosomes, and ran the data that would finally answer the question historians have argued about for 1,000 years. How did a band of pagan Norse raiders transform into French-speaking Christian knights who conquered England in a single bloody afternoon? What the DNA revealed about that transformation rewrites a story we thought we already knew. The results stunned researchers, overturned long-held assumptions, and exposed how identity itself can be rebuilt in just 5 generations. If you're finding this fascinating, hit subscribe. I cover groundbreaking history and science discoveries like this every week. Now let's talk about what the genetic record actually shows. To understand what the DNA tells us, you first have to understand the world that produced it. And that world was bleeding. The early medieval history of Europe was marked by unexpected and turbulent events. Christianity had taken a firm hold across the kingdoms and empires of the continent. Monasteries rose along the rivers, kings were crowned by bishops, Latin was the language of power, and the cross was the symbol of legitimacy. For a brief moment, it looked like Europe had settled into a kind of fragile order. Then the long ships appeared on the horizon. They came from the north, fierce warriors from Scandinavia, sailing vessels so shallow they could navigate any river, any estuary, any coastal inlet. They struck without warning. They burned monasteries to the ground. They carried off gold, silver, livestock, and human beings to be sold as slaves in distant markets. The Christian kings of Europe had no answer for them. Their armies were slow. Their walls were built to repel land invasions, not seaborne raids that vanished before reinforcements could arrive. These warriors were the Vikings, and they ushered the world into the Viking Age, a tumultuous era that radically changed the socio-political picture of Europe and set it on a course that no one could hope to alter. The Vikings were especially active during the 9th and 10th centuries. They amassed large expeditions and sailed in great numbers across the open waters and the riverways of Central Europe, always in search of new plunder. But something was changing in the character of these raids. What began as quick strikes evolved into something far more dangerous. The Norsemen were not just stealing anymore. They were staying. The kingdom of West Francia, the predecessor of modern France, was especially vulnerable. Its rulers had inherited a fractured realm from the collapsing Carolingian Empire. Powerful counts and dukes acted as semi-independent warlords. The royal authority was thin, and the royal coffers were thinner. When the Vikings came, the Frankish kings could not field armies fast enough to stop them. They could only watch as their kingdom was looted, year after year, season after season. Paris bore the worst of it. The capital sat on the Seine, and the Seine was a highway leading straight to the Viking longships. In 845 AD, a Viking warlord named Ragnar led a fleet up the river and held the city hostage until the Frankish king paid him a fortune in silver to leave. He left. He came back. So did others. The Vikings besieged Paris again in 885 AD, this time with hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. The city barely survived. The Frankish kings tried everything. They paid tribute, a humiliating practice that became known as Danegeld. They built fortified bridges to block the rivers. They begged the Pope for spiritual intervention. Nothing worked. The Vikings always returned, and every time they returned, more of them stayed behind. By the early 900s, Norse encampments dotted the northern French coastline. The Cotentin Peninsula was thick with Scandinavian settlers. The lower Seine Valley had Viking farms, Viking longhouses, Viking burial sites. These were no longer raiding parties. These were colonies. Entire families had crossed the sea. Norse women, Norse children, Norse craftsmen, all building lives in territory that technically belonged to the King of France, but practically belonged to whoever could hold it with a sword. the Frankish nobility began to realize something terrifying. The Vikings were not going home. Tribute would not make them leave. Walls would not keep them out. Prayer would not turn back the tide. The Northmen had decided that this stretch of coast was theirs, and they had the warriors to back up that decision. So the question became impossible. How do you defeat an enemy who refuses to leave? How do you protect a kingdom from invaders who have already moved in? The answer would come from one of the most pragmatic and unusual diplomatic decisions in medieval history. A Frankish king would look at the Viking warlords squatting on his northern coast, look at his own depleted treasury and exhausted armies, and make a choice that would change Europe forever. He would not fight them. He would not bribe them. He would give them the land they had already taken, recognize them as nobles of his realm, and turn them into his shield against future raids. He would weaponize the very people who had been bleeding his kingdom dry. And in doing so, he would accidentally create a new people, a people whose DNA scientists would still be unraveling more than 1,000 years later. The Frankish king who made this fateful decision was Charles III, known to history as Charles the Simple. The name is misleading. Simple in medieval French did not mean foolish. It meant straightforward, honest, direct. And Charles was about to make a deal that was anything but simple in its consequences. By 911 AD, Charles had run out of options. A Viking warlord named Hrolfr, known to the Franks as Rollo, had been raiding the Seine Valley for years. He had besieged Chartres. He had bled the royal treasury. He commanded enough warriors to keep the King of France permanently on the defensive. Charles could not defeat him. So Charles invited him to the negotiating table. They met at a place called Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, a small village on the river that marked the rough boundary between Frankish and Viking-controlled territory. What happened there became one of the most consequential treaties of the entire medieval era. The terms were stunning. Charles offered Rollo the lands he had already conquered, a vast stretch of territory along the northern French coast and the English Channel, the regions most densely populated by Viking settlers. In exchange, Rollo had to do 3 things. He had to convert to Christianity and be baptized. He had to swear vassalage to the Frankish king, and he had to defend the realm of West Francia against further Viking incursions. That last condition was the masterstroke. Charles had just turned a Viking warlord into a Viking fighting border guard. Future raiders sailing up the Seine would now have to get past Rollo first. The poacher had been made the gamekeeper. Rollo accepted. He was baptized, taking the Christian name Robert. He kneeled before Charles, at least in theory, and acknowledged him as overlord. And he took possession of a newly created duchy that bore a name reflecting exactly who its inhabitants were. The Frankish word for a Northman was Normand. The land of the Normans became Normandy. The people who lived there became the Normans. The legends around Rollo are larger than life. He was said to be so massive that no horse could carry him, earning him the nickname Ganger Rolf, or Rolf the Walker, because he traveled everywhere on foot. The Norse sagas claim he was the son of a Norwegian earl, though some historians argue he was Danish. The historical truth is murky. What is certain is that he became the first Duke of Normandy, and he founded a dynasty that would dominate European politics for centuries. There's a famous story about the baptism ceremony, possibly apocryphal but revealing nonetheless. As part of the submission ritual, Rollo was supposed to kiss the king's foot. He refused. The Vikings did not kiss anyone's foot. As a compromise, he ordered one of his warriors to perform the act on his behalf. The warrior, equally proud, simply grabbed the king's foot and lifted it to his own mouth, sending Charles tumbling backwards off his throne. The Frankish court was scandalized. The Viking delegation laughed. The treaty held anyway. That moment captures everything about what was happening. 2 cultures were colliding, and the collision was awkward, violent, and transformative. The Vikings were submitting on paper, but they were not surrendering their identity. The Franks were granting territory, but they were not extending real control. What emerged from the wreckage was something entirely new. The Duchy of Normandy was not a Viking kingdom transplanted into France. It was not a Frankish province with Viking tenants. It was a hybrid from the start. Rollo's warriors took Frankish wives, often by force at first, later by choice. Their children grew up bilingual. Norse law and Frankish law existed side by side. Pagan burial customs faded as Christianity took root. Within a single generation, the population of Normandy was no longer Viking, but it was not quite Frankish either. This was the moment the genetic and cultural experiment began. Norse warriors planted in Frankish soil, told to stay, told to rule, told to defend the very kingdom they had spent decades plundering. Charles the Simple had no way of knowing what he had set in motion. He thought he was buying peace. He was actually creating a people who would, within a few generations, conquer England, invade Italy, carve out kingdoms in Sicily, and reshape the political map of Europe. What happened next is where the DNA evidence enters the story, because nobody at the time, not Charles, not Rollo, not the Frankish nobles who signed the treaty, could have predicted how fast these Vikings would stop being Vikings. The transformation would happen faster than anyone imagined possible, and the modern science of ancient DNA has now mapped exactly how it unfolded. In the summer of 2015, a team of scientists from the University of Leicester arrived in the Cotentin Peninsula, the rugged stretch of coastline that juts out from northern France into the English Channel. This was the heart of old Viking Normandy, the region most densely settled by Norse colonists more than 1,000 years earlier. The researchers had a specific mission. They wanted to find out how much Viking blood actually remained in the descendants of those settlers. They recruited 89 male volunteers, all chosen because they had surnames of Scandinavian origin or family roots in the region going back to at least the 11th century. Each volunteer provided a DNA sample. The scientists then sequenced their Y chromosomes. The genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son, making it the ideal tool for tracing paternal ancestry across centuries. The results, when they came in, surprised everyone. Haplogroup I1, the genetic marker most strongly associated with Scandinavian ancestry, appeared in roughly 15% of the volunteers. That was a real signal. It confirmed that Viking DNA had genuinely survived in modern Norman bloodlines, but it was far weaker than anyone had expected. The dominant haplogroup in the samples was R1b, a marker common across Western Europe with no clear Viking origin. The Norse genetic signature in Normandy was real, but it was a minority signal in a much larger Frankish and Gallo-Roman background. This was the first hard piece of evidence for something historians had long suspected but never proven. The Vikings did not replace the population of Normandy. They blended into it, and the blending happened fast. A separate study, published in the journal Nature in 2020, expanded the picture even further. An international team sequenced the genomes of 442 Viking-age skeletons from more than 80 sites across northern Europe, Italy, and Greenland. The researchers had assumed they would find a relatively uniform Scandinavian genetic profile. They found nothing of the sort. The skeletons revealed that the people we call Vikings were already a genetic mosaic before they ever set sail. Southern European ancestry, Anatolian markers, Sami input from the far north. The Vikings were not a pure race. They were a coalition of peoples bound together by culture, language, and a way of life, not by blood. So when Rollo's warriors landed in Normandy, they were already mixed, and then they mixed further. The mechanism is now well understood. Viking expansion was overwhelmingly male-driven. Warriors, traders, and settlers crossed the sea in long ships. Women rarely came on the early voyages. The Norsemen who carved out Normandy took Frankish wives, Gallo-Roman wives, Breton wives, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through conquest. Within a single generation, every Viking child born in Normandy had a Frankish mother. Within 2 generations, the maternal genetic line was almost entirely local. Only the Y chromosome, passed down the male line, preserved the clear Norse signature. The rest of the genome was being rewritten in real time. The cultural data confirms what the genetic data shows. By the time Rollo's grandson, Richard the Fearless, ruled Normandy in the mid-10th century, the duchy had become unrecognizable as a Viking colony. The official language of the court was Old French, not Old Norse. The dukes were devout Christians who endowed monasteries and built cathedrals. Their names were Frankish. Their laws drew on Carolingian tradition. Their armies fought on horseback in the Frankish style, not on foot in the Viking style. Old Norse died out in Normandy within roughly 3 generations of the original settlement. 3 generations. That is faster than most languages disappear, faster than most cultures forget themselves. The grandchildren of Rollo's warriors could not have held a conversation with their grandfathers without an interpreter. And yet, underneath all of that cultural transformation, the Y chromosomes kept telling the truth. The paternal lines persisted, generation after generation, carrying the Norse signal forward through sons who no longer spoke their ancestors' language, no longer worshipped their ancestors' gods, no longer knew the names of the fjords their families had come from. The DNA remembered what the culture forgot. This is one of the most striking findings to come out of ancient genomics in the last decade. Cultural assimilation does not erase biological ancestry. The Vikings of Normandy stopped being Viking in every visible way. They dressed Frankish, they prayed Frankish, they spoke Frankish, but their grandsons' great-grandsons still carried the genetic fingerprints of Scandinavia in their cells. The Vikings did not conquer Normandy and impose themselves on it. They were absorbed by it, and that absorption is written into the DNA of their descendants. The same DNA that would soon cross the English Channel and sit on the throne of England. Something strange happened in Normandy during the 10th and 11th centuries. The Vikings who had settled there were no longer Vikings. They spoke French. They worshipped Christ. They had forgotten the sagas of their ancestors, but they had not forgotten how to fight, and they had not forgotten the hunger for new lands. The Norman identity that emerged from this transformation was something the medieval world had never seen before. It combined the disciplined military traditions of the Franks with the relentless aggression of the Norsemen. It fused Carolingian feudalism with the Viking instinct for opportunistic conquest. The result was a war machine more dangerous than either parent culture had ever produced. The military innovations alone were extraordinary. Norman knights perfected the use of heavy cavalry on a scale Europe had not seen since Roman times. They developed the couched lance technique, holding the weapon tucked tight under the arm so that the full weight and momentum of horse and rider drove the point forward. A charging Norman knight could punch through shield walls that had stopped infantry armies for centuries. They built motte and bailey castles, wooden fortifications thrown up rapidly on artificial mounds, allowing a small force to dominate a large territory by controlling key strongpoints. They mastered combined arms tactics, coordinating cavalry, archers, and infantry in ways that overwhelmed opponents who relied on a single fighting style. None of this came from the Vikings. The Norsemen had been raiders, not cavalrymen. They fought on foot with axes and shields. The horse-mounted shock tactics that defined Norman warfare were borrowed from the Franks and then perfected beyond anything the Franks had managed. The Vikings contributed something else. They contributed the appetite. By the early 11th century, Normandy could not hold its own sons. Younger brothers without inheritance, ambitious knights without land, restless second cousins of the Duke, all began looking outward. They wanted what their great-great-grandfathers had wanted. Territory, plunder, a name carved into stone by the sharp end of a sword. So they sailed, not in longships anymore, but in Frankish-style transports. Not as pagan raiders, but as Christian knights. They went south through the Iberian Peninsula. They crossed into Italy, which they called Langbardaland, the land of the Lombards. They raided the coasts of Tuscany and Liguria. They sacked the city of Pisa. They made incursions into North Africa. And then they did something no one expected. They stayed. The Hauteville family, a clan of Norman adventurers led by a former mercenary named Robert Guiscard, carved out an entire kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. They defeated Byzantine armies, Muslim emirates, and papal forces in succession. Within a few decades, Normans ruled territory stretching from Naples to Palermo. A second Norman kingdom on the opposite end of Europe from Normandy itself, built by the same restless drive that had launched their ancestors out of Scandinavia 2 centuries earlier. This is where the story gets philosophically interesting. The behavior was not encoded in the DNA. Genetics does not carry an instinct for conquest. The Norse appetite for sailing, fighting, and planting new lordships overseas survived not because it was in their blood, but because it was in their stories. Norman children grew up hearing about Rollo. They were told tales of their Sea King ancestors. The cultural memory of Viking restlessness passed from father to son, even as the language and religion of those Viking ancestors faded into nothing. The Y chromosomes kept the genetic signal. The fireside stories kept the behavioral signal. Both signals pointed the Normans outward toward whatever shore they had not yet conquered. And inside Normandy itself, the ducal dynasty established by Rollo was growing into one of the most powerful houses in Europe. The line of succession ran clean for generations. Rollo fathered William Longsword. William Longsword fathered Richard the Fearless. Richard the Fearless fathered Richard the Good. Richard the Good fathered Robert the Magnificent. Each duke expanded Norman power. Each duke tightened the grip of the family on its territory. Each duke built more castles, raised more knights, and pushed Normandy further into the front rank of European military states. Then Robert the Magnificent died in 1035, returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He left behind a duchy poised at the height of its power and a successor poised at the bottom of his luck. An 8-year-old boy, illegitimate, born to a woman of low birth in the town of Falaise, a child whose enemies called him the bastard. That boy would survive what should have killed him. He would become the most consequential descendant of Rollo's line, and he would carry the Norman war machine across a body of water his ancestors knew well, into a kingdom that would never be the same. He was born around 1028 AD in the Norman town of Falaise. His father was Robert the Magnificent, Duke of Normandy and direct descendant of Rollo the Viking. His mother was Herleva, the daughter of a tanner. They were never married. Medieval law and medieval prejudice made the consequences of that fact brutally clear. The boy was a bastard, and everyone in Normandy knew it. The nickname followed him into every room. William the Bastard. It was not a private slur. It was his public name. When Robert the Magnificent died in 1035, returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, William was 8 years old. The duchy passed to him because Robert had named him heir before leaving, but no one in Normandy believed an illegitimate child could actually hold the title. The ambitious Norman nobles stirred immediately. The boy's claim was challenged from every direction. His guardians began dying in suspicious circumstances. One was murdered in the same bedchamber where William slept. Another was poisoned. A third was killed in open combat by rivals trying to seize the duchy. William survived because the people around him died in his place. His tutor, his steward, his uncle. They were cut down protecting a child who should have been killed several times over. He grew up watching his protectors fall and learning the lesson that would define his life. Trust no one completely. Strike before being struck. Survive by being more dangerous than the men who want you dead. By the time he reached his late teens, William was a hardened young warrior. He had spent his entire childhood inside a political bloodbath, and the bloodbath had not killed him. It had trained him. He began consolidating power with a cold, methodical patience that surprised his enemies. He hunted down rebellious barons one by one. He besieged their castles. He confiscated their lands. He demonstrated over and over that the boy they had underestimated was now a man they could not afford to underestimate twice. The struggle lasted 25 years. 25 years of vicious internal warfare to claim a title he had technically held since childhood. He put down rebellions across Normandy. He defeated his cousin Guy of Brionne, who tried to overthrow him outright. He went to war against Geoffrey Martel, the powerful Count of Anjou, and ground down Geoffrey's incursions through sheer persistence. He survived assassination attempts that should have ended him several times over. He also gained a crucial ally. King Henry of France, watching the chaos in Normandy, decided that backing William served his own interests. The royal endorsement gave William legitimacy that no amount of military victory could have produced on its own. By 1060 AD, William's rule over Normandy was solidified and uncontested. The bastard boy had become one of the most feared duke in Europe. He commanded a battle-tested army of professional knights. He controlled a wealthy duchy with a stable administration, and he had spent his entire life waiting for the moment when his strength would be greater than his rival's resistance. His gaze began to drift across the English Channel. The connection to England was not invented. It was real, and it was woven into William's own blood. Edward the Confessor, who had been ruling England since 1042, was the son of a Norman princess. His mother, Emma of Normandy, was the great-aunt of William. The English royal family was, in genealogical terms, a branch of the same Norse-Frankish hybrid lineage that William headed in Normandy. The DNA of Rollo's descendants already sat on the English throne, even if the man wearing the crown thought of himself as Anglo-Saxon. Edward had spent decades in exile in Normandy as a young man before returning to claim the English throne. He spoke Norman French. He surrounded himself with Norman advisors. He filled English bishoprics and court positions with Norman appointees, and crucially, he was childless. There was no obvious heir to the English crown, and William, watching from across the water, came to believe that Edward had personally promised the throne to him during one of his visits to Normandy. Whether that promise was real, exaggerated, or invented after the fact, William believed it, or chose to believe it. The illegitimate son of a Norman duke and a tanner's daughter now considered himself the rightful future king of England. He had clawed his way to the top of Normandy through 25 years of war. He was not going to hesitate when a far larger prize came within reach. Across the Channel, England was about to enter a crisis, and William had been waiting his entire life for it. On January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died in Westminster without leaving an heir. The English throne stood empty. By the next morning, 3 different men in 3 different parts of Europe were preparing to claim it. The first was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. He was the wealthiest noble in England, the head of the most powerful family in the kingdom, and the man Edward had reportedly named as his successor on his deathbed. The English nobility crowned Harold the very next day, January 6th, 1066, in the same Westminster Abbey where Edward had just been buried. The speed of the coronation was deliberate. Harold's supporters knew that other claimants would emerge, and they wanted a sitting king on the throne before the contest began. The second claimant was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. He was the last great Viking warlord of the medieval age, a man who had fought in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, who had served emperors in Constantinople, who had carved out a reputation for ferocity that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. He based his claim on an old treaty between the Norwegian and English crowns dating back to the era of Canute the Great. The legal basis was thin, the military threat was not. The third claimant was William of Normandy. He insisted that Edward had personally promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support that promise. Whether those claims were true or convenient, William believed them, and he had the army to enforce them. Through the spring and summer of 1066, William prepared. He gathered roughly 7,000 to 12,000 men, including Norman knights, Breton spearmen, and Flemish mercenaries. He built a fleet of hundreds of ships. He waited on the French coast for favorable winds to carry him across the Channel. The winds favored Hardrada first. In September, the Norwegian king landed in northern England with a massive Viking army and captured the city of York. Harold Godwinson responded with the kind of speed that defined his short reign. He marched his army from the south of England to the north in a matter of days, covering nearly 200 miles. On September 25, 1066, he attacked Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. The battle was a slaughter. The Vikings were caught half-armored, many of them resting in the late summer sun, unaware that the English army was even close. Harold Godwinson cut them down. Harold Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. His army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegians to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Stamford Bridge was the death of the Viking Age. The last great Norse invasion of England had ended in catastrophic defeat. The era of longships descending on Christian shores was over. 3 days later, the wind across the Channel changed. William of Normandy sailed. He landed at Pevensey on September 28, 1066, with his army intact and his supply lines secure. He began building a wooden castle within hours of coming ashore. Word reached Harold Godwinson in the north, and the English king turned his exhausted, battered army around and marched south. He covered another 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. His men were depleted from Stamford Bridge. Many of his best fighters were dead, but he came anyway. The two armies met on October 14th, 1066, on a ridge called Senlac Hill, near the town of Hastings. The battle lasted from dawn to dusk. Harold positioned his men along the high ground in a tight shield wall, the classic Anglo-Saxon defensive formation. William sent waves of infantry, archers, and heavy cavalry against that wall for hours. The English held. The shield wall did not break. As the day wore on, Norman casualties mounted, and at one point, rumors spread through William's army that the Duke himself had been killed. Then the Normans tried something different. They began feigning retreats. Sections of the English line broke discipline and chased the apparent fugitives downhill, only to be cut down by Norman cavalry that had been waiting to spring the trap. The shield wall thinned, the center weakened. By late afternoon, Norman arrows were falling on the English position in heavy volleys. One of those arrows, according to legend, struck Harold Godwinson in the eye. He fell. His remaining housecarls fought to the death over his body. The English aristocracy was annihilated in a single afternoon. William marched on London. By Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Vikings, who had become Normans, had just become English kings. The arc takes your breath away when you compress it. In 911 AD, a Viking warlord knelt before a Frankish king and accepted a duchy in exchange for converting and defending the realm. By 1066, his great-great-great-grandson sat on the throne of England. 5 generations. That was all it took to transform pagan raiders into Christian kings, Old Norse into Norman French, longships into heavy cavalry, plunder into law. And the DNA tells the deeper truth beneath the political one. The Vikings did not replace the people of Normandy, and the Normans did not replace the people of England. Identity is not carried in blood. It is carried in language, in faith, in story, in the laws we choose to live under. The fiercest warriors of the Viking Age left a faint genetic mark on the lands they conquered and an enormous mark on everything else.